Hello everyone and welcome to SplitSecond. This week we have a special guest with us, Sum Neuron. You might know him from Reddit's Magic Circle jerking, from some MTG Goldfish articles, Commander Herald's articles, or from some cool Ultra sleeves we showcased some time ago. He's been all around town. This week Leite brought his spicy brew for Talrand, David is on Omnath, Locus of the Roil, Nivitch's list, Sum Neuron brought his Zur the Exiler, and Baal updated his Keranos control list. Leite is the one starting and he kept his first 7 with a single island but with a dual Lotus to cast that Merfolk turn 1. He has a Preordain and a Draw Disruption in case he fails to get those land drops. Mental Misstep and Flusterstorm will allow him to decide what resolves and doesn't, while providing with some good drakes for the beatdown. And Cyclonic Rift can eventually deal with a single or multiple threats. David mulliganed once and kept 2 lands, a forest and a misty rainforest. Soul Ring for ramp, Vexing Shusher is great protection for his combo, while Collector Oof can be a bit of a nombo with a ring. Dispel is extra protection, while Manipulate Fate can get him the necessary cards for the food chain loops. Sum Neuron also mulliganed once and kept 3 lands, Forbidden Orchard, Polluted Delta and Underground River. He also has a Soul Ring for ramp. Granite Magistrate can delay opponent's commanders and prevent food chain loops. Bloodshift Ascension goes on one of the possible lines of the deck, while Windfall helps him refill, but is mostly another way to disrupt opponents' libraries. Finally, Baal also mulliganed once and kept 2 lands, Steam Vents and Shivan Reef. With a single Mindstone for ramp, Preordain can help on digging for some lands or controlling pieces, to try to achieve the endgame with Jace, Wielder of Mysteries and Underground Breach. Karn is mostly a non-symmetric null rod in this era of Docksides. Let's split the stack. Leite starts things up with a Jeweled Lotus followed by an island, and a turn 1 Talrand. Q from some grounds from the table. David plays a forest and casts his Sol Ring. Leite ponders saving his misstep to protect Talrand, but eventually fires it onto the Sol Ring, getting a 2/2 Drake in the process. David passes. Sum Neuron plays a Morphic Pool and casts his own Sol Ring, which resolves. Baal starts his turn with an island and casts Preordain, drawing 1 and keeping the other on top. Leite also casts his Preordain, getting another Drake, draws 1, bottoms the other. He found his island and attacks Sum Neuron for 4 before passing. David plays and cracks his Misty Rainforest for a Volcanic Island. He then casts Vexing Shusher and passes. Sum Neuron plays and cracks a Polluted Delta for a Tundra. He then casts a Ruined Crab, testing the waters, and follows it with a Granite Magistrate. He passes to Baal, who plays a Shivan Reef into a Mind Stone before passing. Leite plays an island and swings 4 at David and Talrand at Baal. He passes fully untapped. David plays a Command Tower and casts Collector Oof before passing. Sum Neuron plays his Underground River, triggering the Crab, milling his opponents for 3. He then casts Bloodshift Ascension and passes. Baal shocks himself with the Steam Vents and casts Rhystic Study, to which Leite responds with Draw Disruption, and, thanks to the Oof, Baal can't pay. Leite gets another Drake and Bloodshift gets its first counter. Leite plays a Polluted Delta, and being a little bit afraid of the Ascension, he swings 6 at Sum Neuron before passing. David casts Manipulate Fate, exiling Squee, Eternal Scourge and Miss Griffin, draws and passes. Sum Neuron plays Spire of Industry, triggering the Crustacean for another 3. He follows it with Zur, hoping to get Rest in Peace, despite turning off the Ascension is the main plan of the deck. Baal draws and casts Psychic Surgery. In response, Leite cracks his fetch for a Mystic Sanctuary, putting Rapid Hybridization on top of his library. Leite keeps the pressure onto Sum Neuron to have him in check. He passes to David, who plays a Bloom Tender and passes as well. Sum Neuron plays an Exotic Orchard, triggering the Crab, taking some of the desired lands from David and Baal. He moves to combat and tries to negotiate with Leite for a single Zur trigger, but Leite prefers to be safe and fires his Rapid Hybridization at Zur. With his plans foiled, he casts a Windfall, hoping to refill. Leite responds with a Cyclonic Rift onto Shusher, getting a Drake. David responds with a Dispel and Leite still has it all covered, with a Flusterstorm getting another Drake. Everyone discards and draws 5. Sum Neuron then casts a Demonic Tutor, hoping to manually get that Rest in Peace. But since most of Baal's answers are in the graveyard, he tells him he either gets a Sweeper or he counters the Tutor, so he goes for a Toxic Deluge. Psychic Surgery triggers and he exiles Lightning Greaves. On his turn, Baal fails to draw a land in those 6 cards, so he casts Missions Briefing, surveilling an Index Signet and targets Preordain in his graveyard. He casts it, drawing and playing the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale, to help dealing with Leite's increasing board, especially if he does counter Sum Neuron's Deluge. Leite actually lets go of all Drakes, just paying for Talrand. He plays a Mystic Rainforest, cracking it for an island. Surgery triggers and Baal exiles back to basics. Leite then casts a Polymorph onto Talrand, which lets us wondering. He gets the only creature in his deck, a humble Jin Gitaxias, no big deal. He goes to end step, drawing 7 from the Praetor and then discards to hand size. David, unfortunately, is the first to have to deal with it, and since he is incapable of killing it, he just pays for Blunt Tender and casts a Heuristic Study before going 1 with nothing. Sum Neuron pays for the crab, so he gets to mill some more with his Marsh Flats. He cracks it for an Underground Sea, milling everyone else for 3 more. Surgery triggers, to which Baal exiles a Prismatic Vista. He then casts a Felber Stone, not paying for study, and follows it with a Narset Parter of Veils, not paying again. He casts Toxic Deluge for 5, just in case Leite has some weird pumping effect. The board is cleared, and he then activates Narset, finding and revealing a Time Spiral. He passes to Baal, which casts a Dockside Extortionist, not paying the study, getting 4 treasures. He plays a not so Mystic Sentry as it enters stat, since he only controls 2 other islands. He then casts his commander, Keranos, to start drawing some fuel and maybe deal with Narset. It's Leite's turn and he plays an island and casts a Mana Crypt, not paying the 1. He follows it with an Isochron Scepter, which for a second lets us all fearing for the end. However, he imprints a counterspell, which isn't that great either. He passes fully untapped. David is slow in trying to recoup as he plays an island and casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a forest. He casts Magus of the Moon and passes. Sum Neuron plays a Mountainous Misty Rainforest and activates Narset, finding a Time Twister. Despite the Isochron Scepter, he goes for it and casts Time Twister, paying for the study. They know Baal still has interaction he announced for the Demonic Tutor, and he passes. Leite actually likes the Time Twister idea, so he simply casts a Chain of Vapor on the Narset, paying the 1. Narset is bounced and Sum Neuron actually copies it, sacrificing a land and targeting the Magus of the Moon. Baal taps his Tabernacle while he can to float the red. Leite then responds with a Stern Dismissal on David's Heuristic Study, paying the 1. David then responds with a delay, to which Leite responds with a counterspell from the Isochron Scepter, not paying the 1. Magus is bounced, and after some discussion, David feels he needs to stop the chain or else he'll be the one furthest behind again. With Time Twister still on the stack, Sum Neuron cracks his Rainforest for an island and Surgery exiles Chain of Vapor. Still with Twister on the stack, Baal fires his Cyclonic Rift onto Leite's Isochron Scepter, and we finally shuffle our hands and graveyards for a new 7. Surgery triggers for each opponent and Baal exiles Force of Will, a Destiny Spinner and Narset Parter of Veils. Sum Neuron now casts a Chrome Mox, exiling a Leyline of the Void, and recasts Zur before passing. Baal lets Dockside be destroyed and reveals a Mana Crypt to Keranos, which he aims at Leite. He casts a Mystic Remora and follows it with a Mana Crypt. He then casts Sensei's Divining Top and spins it to look for some answers. He actually found one to help with Talrand, so he activates the top to draw it. He plays a Volcanic Island and casts Aether Flash. On his end step, Bloodschief Ascension gets his second counter and we're back at Leite. He wins the Crypt roll and plays an island. He casts a Heuristic Study, not paying for Remora. He passes the turn. David plays an island and thinks for a bit. He finds an interesting way to go off and starts things with a Dockside Extortionist, paying for the study. Dockside is dealt 2 damage, but manages to provide 12 treasures. He then casts Underworld Breach, paying for the Heuristic, but not for Remora. It resolves, so he then casts Brain Freeze, not paying for Heuristic nor Remora. Leite responds with a Stern Dismissal on the Underworld Breach, not paying for Remora. David, however, responds with a Pyroblast, not paying for both taxing enchantments. Leite and Baal seem to trying to hold interaction on each other, not firing all their bullets, but now Baal has hinted that he needs to interact, so he fires his Swan Song onto the Pyroblast, not paying for study. However, David fires a Pact of Negation on the Dismissal, paying for the study but not for Remora. Baal passes priority and Leite fires a Dispel onto the Pact, not paying for Remora. Underworld Breach is bounced and Brain Freeze finally resolves with 1 extra copy, milling David for 6, and Aether Flash was actually enabling David to go off with the Dockside. But during the counter war, Leite accidentally revealed an Unwind from his hand, so David doesn't recast Underworld Breach. Instead, he casts a Stranglehold, not paying for Heuristic nor Remora, and passes. Sum Neuron pays for the Tabernacle trigger and plays a tapped Godless Shrine. He then attacks David, who's stopping him from tutoring. He then casts an Alms Collector, paying for the study before passing. Baal pays to keep the Remora and wins the Crypt roll. He reveals a Polluted Delta with Keranos, which makes him draw an extra card. He plays a Fiery Islet, and since he's out of ways to deal with the board or control both Leite and David, he casts a Wheel of Fortune, not paying the 1. Leite, however, casts his Unwind, not paying for Remora. Sum Neuron then responds with a Force of Negation, paying for the study but not for Remora. Leite then responds with his own Force of Will on the Force of Negation, pitching a Preordain. Baal actually draws an answer. He Spell Pierces the Unwind, not paying the 1. Leite then responds with his own Spell Pierce, not paying for Remora. Baal decides not to pay and lets the stack be cleared. He then casts a Soul Ring, not paying for the study. He follows it with a Mana Vault, not paying for the study again. He then proceeds to cast Windfall. Now you may be wondering why this insistence in giving a handful of cards to Sum Neuron and only one to everyone else. Basically, Baal is gambling on Sum Neuron not being able to win with the next handful of cards and Baal being able to recoup easier thanks to Keranos and Remora. Leite then responds with a delay not paying for the fish. Baal draws and casts a Force of Will, pitching a Magic Mirror, not paying for the study. Leite then responds with a Swan Song, not paying for the fish. Baal gets a bird which is instantly shocked and the windfall is countered. Baal then casts a Ponder, not paying for the study. He doesn't like what he sees, so he shuffles before drawing. He then finishes the turn with a Time Twister, finally accomplishing what he fought for, taking all interaction from Leite and David and hoping the table survives Sum Neuron's next turn. Sum Neuron gets to draw 10 cards, while everyone else draws 1 and Surgery triggers 3 times, exiling a Midnight Clock, Druid Phantasm and Demonic Tutor. At his end step, +Shift Ascension finally gets his third counter. Leite loses the crit roll, draws and plays an island before passing. David draws and casts a Carpet of Flowers, paying for the study, but not for Remora. He goes to his second main phase to trigger it and casts his commander, Omnath, paying for the study and pinging Baal for 1. He plays a tap Stomping Ground, triggering Omnath for a counter before passing. Sum Neuron forgets to pay for the Tabernacle. In the middle of this turn, we confuse the mana payments, thinking he did pay for it. It could change how he played out this turn, but the outcome wouldn't be so different, so he chose to showcase this game anyway. He starts his turn with the Chains of Mephistopheles, not paying for the Rhystic nor Remora. He then casts Lotus Petal, not paying again, since now in order to draw from Rhystic or Remora their controllers must first discard a card. In response, Leite casts Stern Dismissal on the Ascension, not paying for Remora. In response, Sum Neuron casts a Force of Negation, not paying again. Leite discards to draw from Rhystic and Sum Neuron drains him for 2 with Ascension. Then Baal does the same with his Remora, getting drained as well. Leite actually drew and cast a Syncopate on the Fawn, where X equals 7. Remora triggers and Baal discards another land to draw a card, getting drained by the Ascension. Sum Neuron only has 6 mana left, so the Force is countered. Baal skips this Remora trigger and Ascension is finally bounced, so Baal discards to draw again and Leite skips his last trigger. Petal finally resolves, and Sum Neuron cracks it to cast Ruin Crab again. He then plays a Command Tower, milling his opponents for 3. He follows it with +Shift Ascension, not paying for the Remora, and Baal discards another tutor to draw a card. This time he fires a Force of Will, pitching his Swan Song, so there is no more draining from Sum Neuron. He attacks Baal for 4, and on his second main phase he casts Time Spiral, not paying for Remora. Baal discards a land, but draws nothing, so Time Spiral alongside Chains and Alms Collector means they all shuffle their graveyards and hands into the deck, and Sum Neuron, who would draw 10, instead mills 10, and each other player who would draw 1 instead mills 1. Surgery triggers and Baal exiles a Sapphire Medallion, a Blood Moon and an Ashiok. Everyone is hellbent and he passes. Baal loses the crit roll, pays for Remora and takes one from the vault. He reveals a misdirection with Keranos, with which he bolts Sum Neuron. He passes. Leite wins the crit roll, draws and simply passes. David pays for Tabernacle, plays and cracks an Arid Mesa for a Taiga, getting some more counters on Omnath and then swings with them at Leite before passing. Sum Neuron pays for his 3 creatures, plays a Mana Confluence, triggering the crab, and then attacks Baal for 4 before passing. On his end step, Baal sacrifices his Mind Stone, discarding his Misdirection to draw a card, looking for a way out. On his upkeep, he wins the crit roll, lets the fish die and pays to untap the Mana Vault. He reveals a Shattering Spree to Keranos, which he aims at the crab, since he drew a Ponder earlier. For a second, he thinks on using the Spree on his Mana Crit, but decides to cast Ponder instead, looking for something. He doesn't pay for Rhystic and Leite discards and draws as well, also digging for answers. Baal discards and draws and then passes to Leite. Leite loses the crit roll, plays an island and passes. David pays for the Tabernacle and then adds 9 red from Carpet. With it, he casts Dockside Extortionist, paying for the Rhystic and getting another 12 treasures before dying to the Aether Flash. He then casts Misthollow Griffin from the exile, also paying for the study. He then attacks with Omnath at Sum Neuron this time around. Sum Neuron pays for the Tabernacle, draws and casts Mystic Remora, not paying for Rhystic, which Leite actually discards and draws. Baal decides not to draw from his Remora, and Sum Neuron attacks Baal for 4, and we're back at his turn. He wins the crit roll and reveals a Vandal Blast with Keranos, which he fires at Sum Neuron. He passes without much to do. Leite wins the crit roll, draws and passes. Leite is being stopped by Baal, which in turn is stopped from developing by Sum Neuron, which in turn is stopped by Stranglehold. In this train of thought, Nivitch starts by attacking Leite for 9 and passes. Sum Neuron pays for Tabernacle and Remora. He keeps hitting Baal for 4. In response, Baal cracks his Fiery Eyelet to discard and draw a card. He draws and casts a Red Elemental Blast targeting Zur, paying for the Remora, but not paying for Rhystic, to see if Leite gets something. Sum Neuron then responds with a delay, paying for Rhystic but not Remora. Baal doesn't draw from Remora, but responds with a counterspell, not paying for Rhystic nor Remora. Sum Neuron actually mills himself with the Remora trigger and Leite discards and draws from the Rhystic study. Baal takes 3 and Sum Neuron has no mana to recast Zur, so he passes. Baal loses the crit roll and reveals a Merchant Scroll with Keranos, with which he points at Leite before passing. Leite is also on the losing side of the coins, taking another 3. He casts Ponder, not paying for the Remora, and Sum Neuron mills 1. Leite doesn't like the top 3, so he shuffles before discarding and drawing. Also without answers, he passes to David, which is still in a good spot after all this disruption. He plays a Rejuvenating Springs, growing Omnath, and since he has 8 lands, he must draw a card, which with Chains becomes discard then draw. After some pondering, he attacks Sum Neuron for lethal, arguing that statistically the creeps will deal with one of the other 2 players. Before damage, Sum Neuron taps Pyre and Mana Confluence to ping himself, so that David feels annoyed that his attack wasn't mathematically perfect. On his second main phase, he adds pink mana from Carpet and casts Eternal Scorch, paying for the Rhystic before passing. It's Baal's upkeep, and the creep takes him down. Only 1 to go. All this damage and Leite actually wins the roll. He cycles Lonely Sandbar and finds a Time Twister. This might have been the game with more Time Twisters and wheels we ever had. He's desperately looking for the Cyclonic Rift, but fails, so he casts Talrand, although David counters it with a Red Elemental Blast, paying the 1, so Leite scoops it up. GG. Thank you for joining us for today's match, everyone. After being the first and the only Hellbent player after Jingi taxes, David managed to slowly build up and win this grindy and wheelie match. We'd like to start the credits by thanking our current patrons, and especially Izanagi, Stefan, TJ Rapp, Mike Purr, Ajimu, Heated Chill, Drunken Housecat, V, RJ, Starfall and Brandon Glazebrook, our stack breakers. If you want to support us, you can do so by liking this video, subscribing or by becoming a patron yourself. If you want to go through other Commander adventures, click one of the videos on the right. If you want to talk with us about our games or other EDH related matters, join us on Discord. Join us again next week for a new set of Commanders and more decisive plays. See you all then!